I have a very strong relationship to the bees. The bees were my first power animal, and I have a very intimate, loving relationship with bees, and I communicate with these beings, and they told me that the light pollution is disrupting their circadian rhythms and that they can't rest. And that's why they keep moving out of hives, because people start colonies of bees and then they just disappear. And the bees told me we can't rest. It's like we are up all night long, and it's burning us out. And we're desperate to find areas that's dark enough at night. And, these are real things. So could you touch on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one thing I really want to emphasize here is just because we can't see it doesn't mean that light's not present. Like we mentioned earlier, there's a very small fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can actually see, that's visible light. But we have all of our radio frequencies, whether it's from, antennas, radar, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, 5G, 4G, etc. Those are all forms of light as well. And so if it's dark outside and those frequencies are still around, it's not actually dark. So for these animals that we're also animals that can sense those frequencies, I would argue. We can't see them. But for animals that can see these frequencies and or sense them, they're never receiving that darkness in the evening that allows them to have healthy circadian rhythms. And it's also worth noting here as well that people should be, if you can, turn your Wi-Fi off at night. Don't sleep with your devices around your bed. Curate a dark environment as possible. If you have street lights outside, try to get a blackout curtain so that no light is coming through. You really want a dark environment that's dark not only from visible light, but also non-visible light to the best of your ability. And for people who work shift work or who can't go to sleep, rise and sleep with the sun, let's say, one thing that you should really at least try to dial in is your blue light exposure. So independent of sleep, darkness and bright light during the day are very important. So even if you're not able to go to sleep, as early as you would like, wearing your blue blockers and preventing that blue light from coming into your eyes starting around sunset is really, really important to at least send the signal to your body that, there's no blue light present, it's dark. It's not going to be perfectly dark, of course, because you're still going to be operating somewhere with light to use the glasses, but at least that signal of blue is gone, so that's allowing your body to relax a bit, to become less cortisol dominant and have that melatonin to rise up, and that helps to engage the processes in the system that are associated with the evening, which include things like cellular turnover, regeneration, repair, autophagy, things like this that are required in the darkness. But if we're never getting that darkness, we don't engage those processes appropriately. So we need to make sure we're curating the right environments for ourselves during the day and in the evening. And if you're doing that, even if you're shorting yourself on sleep, you're going to receive benefits from it by simply eliminating the blue light from the environment starting when the sun goes down. And it's the same for, for all the critters outside too. And I wish that we could just get some policy change and get all of our streetlights turned to amber or red. I think it would be a simple solution that would dramatically reduce light pollution, but we got some work to do.
Yeah, the problem, Alexis, as you know, is the number of compounding factors, any one of which is seriously threatening, has now reached a list of, it would be pages long, from water pollution to air pollution to electromagnetic pollution to soil pollution to toxicity in medical drugs to mind manipulation with fifth generation warfare and phones. And when you start looking at 5G and all, it can be fucking overwhelming. I've been talking about these things and teaching soil science for 40 fucking years. And, my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, came out in 2004. I got all this stuff in there that people are now just beginning to think is cool new stuff. And I'm like, I was lecturing on this before you were fucking born. But the point I'm making is that it's sad because I go around the world and it's almost like I was never here. It's like, oh my God, I've tried so hard. We've probably sold 250,000 copies of How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy. And it's like the magnitude of the disinformation, confusion, and manipulation and destruction of the environment and humanity and the food supply is happening at a rate that is so fast, it would take 1,000 of me and you having kids every 10 minutes and educating them to go out and be teachers to begin to confront it, which is one of the main reasons I do my podcast, because I say all the time, look, it's an all hands on deck situation. And so if you want to be an expert in light, teach light. If you want to be an expert in food, teach food. But we need everybody to find their dream in their heart, and whatever it is they can do to contribute, it's time to get out and share your love because, I don't want to be a fatalist, but I'm a realist. If you start adding up all these, all you got to do is, here's an analogy I give my patients about their lives after doing an assessment on them. I say, look, if you get bit by one mosquito, it's no big deal. But if 500 bite you at once, you're probably going to get malaria. And it's a metaphor. And when I look at my patients, some of which think they're very holistic, they're personal trainers and healthcare professionals, and I look at the way they eat and the way they live, and it's all magazine health. Sports bars, canned drinks, and packaged vitamins, and they're not even close to living a healthy life. So the number of negative inputs that are stressing the body, you take, okay, this is worth a point, that's worth a point. Well, the next thing you know, you don't have enough anabolic power to deal with the catabolic stress. Anabolic, for those of you that don't know, tissue regenerative, catabolic, tissue destructive, or catabolic yang, energy and resource consumptive, yin, energy and resource accumulative. So we're outgassing far more energy, resources, and life force than we can recover. And this is why all the circadian stuff is so important, because there's nothing more anabolic than quality sleep. That's been the doctor's best medicine for thousands of years. But the number of people that come to me that can't sleep is through the roof.
Totally. And whenever I see people, like you mentioned earlier, when you were coming up to your midlife crisis and you were waking up in the middle of the night like wired and awake, and it's so common, and it's pretty frequently seen that we see like a cortisol rise early, especially if you're engaging in a lot of tech use in the evening, and you're exposing yourself to a lot of light before bedtime, whether it's watching TV before bed or maybe even sleeping with the TV on. If that cortisol starts rising early, it's kicking on the sympathetic response, and it's trying to get you up and going, even if it's not the right time to do that. But circling back to what you just said briefly, I think I'm a little bit hopeful since COVID. Like, people seem to be waking up at more increasing rates, let's say.
Yeah, they are, for sure.
Yeah.
It's lovely. It's lovely.
When I started talking about this, when I fell down the rabbit hole on this stuff in April of 2023, it's almost been 2 years. It's been like warp speed, and like people are really interested in this topic and to learn more. And I honestly barely get any pushback from anybody. Everybody just seems to resonate. It's like, oh, this makes sense. This is just, we're getting back into nature. We're just trying to get into rhythm with the sun and with natural light and dark cycles, and eating seasonally. And we could talk about the benefits of that, like mechanistically, but just logically, it makes sense to eat in alignment with your environment so that your body is able to be adapted to that environment. Getting cold when it's cold out, getting hot when it's hot out, sweating, moving your body, like just all these very basic things that people can get access to for mostly free. It doesn't require an expensive pill or potion. It's really just getting back to basics.
Well, people forget we are the environment.
Exactly.
I mean, we're turning over 2 million red blood cells a second. Your epidermis turns over about every 3 days. Your bone cells turn over, I think it's every 6 weeks approximately. You turn over every single cell in your body based on current science every 365 days. So you're actually like a waterfall. I mean, a fountain. I'm sure you've seen big fountains in parks. And when you're far enough away, it looks like an ice sculpture. You don't realize it's water moving, but as you approach it, you see it's actually flowing. So the human body is like a hologram that is a living structure, but it's replacing it based on what you eat and drink and breathe and the light that you're engaging. And if we don't give it what it needs, then the capacity for us to maintain the structure that makes Alexis recognizable as Alexis starts to break down, right? If the next time I saw you, you were 100 pounds bigger and had pimples all over your face, I might not know who you were, right? So the point I'm making, and this is, in my holistic lifestyle coaching program, I teach a concept called the echo. And the echo is to describe how we interact with our environment. In our environment, we have energy, chemistry, hydration, and organisms. And whatever we do to the chemistry in the environment, we do to ourselves. Whatever we do to the energy in the environment, such as electromagnetic radiation and all the things we're talking about, we do it to ourselves. Whatever we do to the capacity to hydrate ourselves and poison the water or lack water, we do to ourselves. And whatever we do to the organisms in the environment, we do to ourselves, because everything that we're replacing is coming from out there. And then our waste goes out into the environment. And here's an interesting little factoid for you. Having studied the history of soil science, in China and in native cultures, they often collected all their poop. It was called
midnight soil.
Right.
Yes.
But now the top soil scientists in the world say don't ever put your poop in your garden because it's so toxic it can kill the microorganism in the soil. So we have actually gotten to the point where we are a threat to nature. And this is why we have got to support biodynamic and organic and free-range farmers, because they're the only ones regenerating and nourishing and healing and growing our topsoil base, which is the basis of health. So I really love our dialogue here because it's really bringing it full spectrum. It's not just light alone. It's not food alone. You can become a food fanatic. You can become an exercise fanatic. But you know, are you familiar with my 4-doctor system?
I am.
So you can't be a 3-doctor person and be healthy.
Yes.
We can't be a light expert and expect to be healthy, because I work with sick experts all the time.
Totally.
You know, we've got to look at this. And here's the paradox. If you study quantum physics, it's all made of light.
Exactly.
Everything. All atoms are light moving at just under the speed of light in an entangled relationship. So, you know, all the food, everything we're talking about is actually a discussion about light.
It is. And I really like the definition of food. We can think about food as being a barcode for the light environment in which it was grown, assuming it was grown and not made in a lab, which I would argue anything made in a lab is not food. It's not really food.
Well, just to touch on that, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I've tested this, and I'm very, very sensitive because I do subtle energy work and work with people's energy fields and stuff. And through all my years of Tai Chi and Qigong, I've tuned myself very well. But one thought that came to my mind is if you look at quantum physics and physics, they basically conclude that everything in the created universe is energy, information, and frequency. And so if the food's not healthy, it's not the right frequency and it's not the right information. If you're eating genetically modified food, you're bringing something into your body it doesn't have a clue what to do with. I could go on an hour conversation, but we have to realize that the energy, information, and frequency spectrum that we are designed to interface, which is why my echo concept is so important, is that of nature itself. And we're imposing all these external, not native, foreign energies, informations, and frequencies. If you want to know how powerful frequency, and just study homeopathy.
Yes.
Right? There's your answer. So I guess my only point that I'm trying to elaborate is everything we're talking about, including the light, has to be incorporated in your life with a level of consciousness that's adequate to keep you healthy. And you must be aware that today it's more important than ever to do these things, because the number of negative inputs that we have to deal with and defend ourselves against is the highest it's ever been. And our government agencies are pumping this shit at us like there's no tomorrow. And if you study food science, they've been extracting nutrition and ruining food since the Second World War. I mean, so we've got to really get together and protect the real scientists and protect the real farmers and fund them and support them. And thank God for people like you that are giving us enough knowledge to wake up and say, oh my God, you know I really need to get blue blockers. I said to you, I need to get better lights in my house because I want the support of the light. I don't want to have to use biogeometry to defend me against my light bulbs. I've been meaning to do it for a long time, but I've just been so goddamn busy. I'm like, okay, I got to do this, and I keep looking at them, but you're my trigger, and I wrote it down, and by the next time I see you, I'll have new lights in here.
Yay, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, oh my gosh, there's so much I could mention. Just briefly, you mentioned about homeopathy and subtle frequencies having a major impact on the body. This is also what Robert O. Becker found, the author of The Body Electric. He found this in his research, that very small frequencies were able to magnify within biological systems and have very meaningful outcomes. And that's what he found with bone regeneration. So a lot of people don't know that bone doesn't actually heal, it regenerates completely. And so when bone regenerates, it basically is taking a very, very small, subtle frequency that is propagating through the semiconductor matrix of the tissue that is facilitating that regeneration process. And so it should make perfect sense then that other very subtle energies can also have major impact on our biology. I also wanted to circle back. You were talking about metabolic typing, and how I want to talk about how this relates to mitochondrial health and mitochondrial haplotypes as well. So there are two primary classes of mitochondria that people can have. It's kind of more of a spectrum, but just broadly, we have uncoupled mitochondria and coupled. The terms coupled and uncoupled come from that electron transport chain that we talked about earlier. So the closer those protein complexes are to each other, the more coupled they are, the more coupled the flow of electrons is to the production of energy. And so the coupled mitochondria, they're the most ancestral type. They come from the cradle of humanity in West Africa. Their L0 haplotype is the oldest mitochondrial haplotype known. It's extremely coupled, and it's the same reason why marathon runners from Kenya just absolutely kick ass, because their mitochondria are so efficient at making energy, they can, just outrun anybody else. And that comes from the fact that they live in a very high UV light environment. Not only is it equatorial, but it's also at a high altitude. And the higher up you go in altitude, the more UV light you have available from the sun. And the closer you are to the equator, the more UV light you receive year round. So these are the really coupled mitochondria. They live in more equatorial regions. They are able to subsist on more carbohydrate-containing foods year-round because that's naturally growing in their environments. And as it turns out, this also links back to the deuterium story that I alluded to earlier. Deuterium is a heavier form of hydrogen. It's not radioactive. Tritium is the radioactive hydrogen, but deuterium has one neutron. Light hydrogen, protium, has no neutrons, just a proton and electrons. Deuterium has this extra neutron, and because of that, deuterium is bigger in size. And we talked about earlier the electron transport chain and separating positive from negative charge, electrons from protons. The mitochondria are extremely racist against deuterium. They do not want deuterium in there because, as it turns out, when you go to dissipate the gradient that's formed with the protons to bring them back into the inner matrix that facilitates the production of ATP, deuterium doesn't really fit through the pore very well, and so it gets stuck there. It can gunk up the engines, and it can cause the mitochondria to break down. And so when you're somewhere more equatorial and you're eating more roots and fruits, let's say more carbohydrate-containing foods, there's much more deuterium in those foods, but because you're in a more warmer climate with higher UV light, your body's actually able to detox that deuterium more readily. Sweating is a major route of detox for deuterium. Urination is another one. We also think that UV light exposure onto the skin, which can facilitate what's called human photosynthesis, whereby melanin, instead of chlorophyll in plants, works on the light to split water. In humans, there's research suggesting that melanin can serve a similar function, that it can basically separate water into free electrons, protons, and oxygen, thereby creating free energy. But it can also reform, so melanin is just super interesting. It's also a major detoxification molecule. It can pull out heavy metals from the bloodstream, and so getting a tan is incredible for you from a detoxification standpoint, also from a human photosynthetic standpoint. But that melanin can also reform water, and in doing so, it can remove deuterium from that water because it only reforms water with the light hydrogen. And so if you live somewhere equatorial, you can handle more deuterium in your foods because your environment is equipping your system to be able to deal with it, compared to somebody who lives, let's say they have a very uncoupled mitochondrial haplotype from Scandinavia. So my haplotype is H2, it's Scandinavian. I have basically Vikings from my mom's side, and my dad's side is West African primarily, so I'm mixed. But my mitochondria, because all mitochondria come from mom, my mitochondria come from Scandinavia. And so what that means is I have a very uncoupled mitochondrial haplotype that has uncoupled the flow of electrons from the production of energy, and in doing so, it allows the mitochondria to release more heat, more light into the environment. More infrared and UV light is released from my mitochondria, especially in response to cold. So cold is a really strong stimulator of mitochondrial metabolism. And whenever you stimulate mitochondrial metabolism, because that process is the process by which light is made, you get cold, you stimulate light production. So it's actually a perfect system when you think about it, because in the wintertime, let's say in Norway in the wintertime, when sun is very scarce and there's no UV light, the cold actually allows your body to become its own sun. It's compensating for the lack of infrared and UV light from the sun by producing its own in response to cold. And so the uncoupled mitochondria are really good at doing that, but they don't do as well with higher deuterium loads in the diet. And that's why, like you were alluding to, when the ground freezes, you don't really have plant food options. You're relying more on protein and fat as your primary energy sources, and your mitochondria, if they're uncoupled, do really well with eating a higher fat and protein diet, because now they're able to actually make more of that light and heat that they need in order to survive the winter, essentially. And then, of course, if it's summertime and there's plant foods available, then you can eat them because it's a warmer temperature, you can sweat more, you can process that deuterium more. So the seasonal eating and like the mitochondrial haplotypes and the links to metabolic typing and eating a metabolically appropriate diet, I think is just super interesting.
It's amazing stuff. You know, you're doing two things for me right now, Alexis. One, you're giving me new ways of understanding light and a lot of the stuff. I've listened to Jack Kruse talk about this, but I find you easier to digest. I don't know why, but maybe it's just your delivery. I can actually process what you're saying better. Just like it's easier to read Marie-Louise von Franz talk about Carl Jung's work than it is to read his own work, or some Steiner initiates explain Steiner better than Steiner does. It's not unusual for geniuses to be so genius they have a hard time stepping it down.
Totally.
But you're also validating everything I've been teaching for my whole career, because it's based on the principles of nature.
Yes.
I remember the first time I did a podcast with Ben Greenfield, he said to me, Paul, one of the criticisms I get about your book is that it's outdated.
Oh, please.
And I said, Ben, I handed him the book and I said, I challenge you to find one thing in this book that's outdated. If you do, I'll kiss your ass on the highest table in the busiest restaurant in town. I can't remember if I told him that on or off the recording. But I said, that's ridiculous, because this is all based on foundation principles. There's no way you can escape the reality of nutrition, hydration, sleep, breathing, thinking, and movement. So if you can tell me when any of those is outdated, I'll be very interested to know, because at that time there will be no human beings on the planet.